Welcome back to eNCA's post-State of the Nation address panel debate. Well, I'm going to bring in members of our audience here, but before I do that, you wanted to chip in.
A little bit more than that, but thank you very much. The first is that we need to start talking about the future of the country, not its past and present only. The second is that leadership matters across society, across the political parties. And the real test, as Karima is saying, is can we forget our own parochial interests now and put the national interest first and develop a common purpose around youth unemployment, around what happens in townships, around what the kind of business ethics we have or government ethics we have. The third is all of us must pay that which we can afford to pay. That's what a progressive tax system is known for. So it's not everybody who is poor, or not everybody who's not paying is poor. There are a lot of people who can afford to pay but refuse to pay. And some of them are in big business. Some of them are actually tampering with prepaid meters so that they can avoid paying. That kind of mini corruption, if you want to call it that, is something that we as a society should look down upon. The fourth is the economy. And here the President was very explicit. There's opportunities in tourism, there's opportunities in the agricultural sector, there's opportunities in the industrial sector. Mining can once again play an important role in our society, provided that we can earn the business confidence, get the investment show going again, in addition to the 250 billion rands, and what the group of business people have put forward as the 43 projects as well. If we all work together, each of these things can in fact become a reality in the next year or two, or we can go on squabbling amongst ourselves. So if we're really interested in the welfare of the 57 million people, the script was put forward yesterday. It's for us to enact it, make the choices that we have to make, and take a bold step forward, as the President said, and make things happen together.
An obvious question, I guess, would be, do organizations like Business Unity South Africa get tough, with rogues among yourselves, or those who are not paying their dues, as you are, for example, with corrupt politicians?
Well, Karima is a true African. She knows that gestures with Africans, when you shake your head, it's not necessarily meaning that you disagree. You say, oh, this is terrible. Or that when you nod, you don't necessarily agree, but you acknowledge the point made. But the point is this, that we have taken a very firm line as business on ethical conduct. Many in our midst have blemished business, and it's true that for every corrupt individual there's a corrupter, and often that corrupter is in the ranks of business. So the crisis of corruption in society is pervasive. It is across the board. We've taken certain steps. KPMG will tell you that not only have they been kicked out of some of the organized business formations, but also that a number of businesses have taken them off their list of auditors. So they have lost a lot of business across the board. McKinsey similarly has been taken off and has been ostracized, and we've taken some of those steps. Have we done enough? I don't think so, because I think that we see manifestation of this phenomenon everywhere. So as much as we have to continue the fight in the state system against corruption, we have to do the same in business. And such steps as we've taken are far from adequate. We need to continue with the insistence on ethical leadership and ethical conduct. It manifests in various ways. People not paying what they're supposed to pay, people trying to cut corners with the tax contribution, etc., etc., etc. So ethical conduct and ethical leadership is one of the key issues that we have to deal with in this society. And as business, we would like to play our role in that together with all the other actors in society.
More vigorously.
Yeah.
Asanda,
Look, I actually just want to sort of shift a little bit and talk about how the President said yesterday that he wants a digital economy. And one of the things that struck me is that at some stage former President Thabo Mbeki said we are a country of two nations. So I feel like the President yesterday yesterday was speaking to the other nation that has the nation that has schools with computers that actually work and teachers who actually know how to use those computers. And I'm wondering, how is the government going, how is the president and the Minister of Basic Education going to make sure that, you know, yes, it's great that we've got, you know, coding, that we've got all of these new things that are coming into curriculum, but you've got schools sitting with computers that have been donated that are just purely there for decoration because teachers don't even know how to use them. So how are we going to bring those people into that? And then you also have issues like, for example, our government has failed to regulate Uber, has failed to regulate Taxify, has failed to regulate Uber Eats. And what is happening is that because of these failures, when people who are put down as independent, when things happen to people who are independent contractors in the process of work, how are those people protected? You've got a guy in Durban who was shot while he was busy trying to get his delivery. What happens to that guy? What happens to his family? Because he's seen as an independent contractor. There are no laws that are there to regulate what happens when technology removes, removes the sort of safety nets that we have in South Africa in terms of labor law. So I'm really interested to see how we are going to deal with such conundrums, because it's really nice and well to say, let's build smart cities, let's move into the future, let's be part of the fourth industrial economy. It's good for the people who are already at the third. What happens to the people who are still at the first? And we know that this country has a huge inequality deficit. And for me, the proof is going to be in the pudding in terms of how does the government ensure that we bring the people who are at the first industrial revolution into the fourth industrial revolution, and then we talk about what do we do now that we have arrived at the fourth industrial revolution.
Connect them to the first world economy. Use all the stolen money all over the world, in Dubai and elsewhere. Bring it back here, and every school can have all the things that you're actually talking about. And within 5 years, our society will look different. Bring back the stolen money.
Okay. I'm going to bring in our audience now. COSATU's parliamentary officer is here. A lot has been said here that's going to obviously affect workers. Just your thoughts from what you've heard from the panel.
Look, I think as COSATU, for the first time in many years, we welcome the Central Nation Address. We were quite pleased the President focused mostly on the economy, how to grow it, create new sectors, which is quite hopeful. I think we must say the President has done well to lead the investment drive, or better create jobs. But we're quite worried that the jobs target is too low. It's not ambitious enough. We need to create about 50,000 jobs a month, and our target is to create about 2 million over 10 years. We're not going to break the back of unemployment. For us, it's a crisis. We had a very good job summit hosted by the President last year, progressive companies. We've been quite disappointed that business since that time in many sectors, banking, agriculture, mining, has responded by retrenching workers every month. That's been disappointing. We were pleased that the Minister Pravin Gordhan, the President, committed not to retrenching SOE workers. It's positive. I think we need to have more engagements about how to stabilize and save the SOEs. Because we're quite worried last time we didn't really get enough flesh, especially on ESCOM, particularly time bomb. I think maybe lastly, around the issue of corruption, the President is a credible messenger. He's done well around corruption. We've seen the First Minister, Provincial Minister of Finance, now sitting in prison with orange overalls. That's positive. I think we're pleased by the leadership changes in the NPA, etc. The targets even making us safe about taking back 14 billion rand of stolen money. We want to see a bit more action in that front. And of course, as Cyril was saying, the leadership of many committees waters that message down. Maybe lastly, just to respond to Karima, look, corruption hits every part of society. We've been pleased, even as COSATU, we've also had to battle that demon. Some of our unions have already launched forensic audits of some of their own challenges on pension funds to chase back some of that also stolen money. So I think, yeah, it's a war we all need to wage. Maybe lastly, we were a little bit worried about some parts of the Sona which were not detailed enough around targets and time frames. But hopefully the ministers in the budget speeches will put more flesh to it.
I see a few members of parliament here from the opposition bench. Your thoughts?
Thanks very much, Vuyo. Good morning to the panelists and colleagues. I think on the positive side, the President's speech was clearly focused on the economy and growth. and it was a very obvious slap down to his opponents inside his party who would seek to take the economy down a destructive and dangerous path, with his reaffirmation of the independence and the mandate of the Reserve Bank, and very little other mention, if any other mention, of destructive policies like prescription of assets and so on. However, what was clearly lacking was a great deal of detail about the tough choices required to actually make those things happen. So insofar as the President is seriously committed to a singular focus on economic growth that provides more budget to do all of the things that the Minister has spoken about this morning, then he will certainly have our support. But he must also remember that to make that happen, it's not just good enough to talk about it in lofty and dreamy terms. It also requires really tough decisions on what to do about failing state-owned entities. And there's no comment on the Minister present, but we have to answer the fundamental question that the Minister of Finance asked last year, not rhetorically, I hope. Why do we need these enormous drains on our public purse where we get very, very little strategic benefit for them? The President has to answer how he intends to take national health insurance forward when it's clearly an unaffordable pipe dream at this current juncture in our country. Those are the kind of really difficult decisions. South African Airways is another one that is most pressing. When will it go into business rescue and be prepared for sale? Those are the difficult decisions that we've got to have more detail about in the upcoming budget speeches, and hopefully the President can really show that his speech last night was not just a kind of dreamer's prosperity gospel, but that it is backed up by real tough action.
Minister, what should happen to SAA and other failing SOEs?
No, I think firstly there's a commitment to get the State-Owned Enterprises Council going, where we can take a holistic view of all of the state-owned entities. Secondly, it is time for South Africans and government to ask which ones do we need and which ones have a future and which ones can be repositioned for other things.
Have you even begun to interrogate the question?
When you are confronted with bills like the ones I'm talking about, 420 billion or 20 billion for SAA and for other amounts of money, smaller, for institutions like Denel or refurbishing the rail lines and trains on the process side, you have to start configuring all of the choices that you have and which direction that you actually move in. At the same time, I think my colleague from Parliament makes a correct point. Can we get into the details? So it's not the President's job in a Sona to give details. He sets the rail track, he sets the direction, gives us as a country the motivation to move forward. Ours is the job to, as you correctly pointed out, in the budget speeches and preparation for that, begin to pan out some of the details and then prove to you that we're actually getting things done. So it's easy to say, sell SAA or put it into business rescue if they are COSATU-affiliated unions, but there are other unions there as well. What are we going to tell the 11,000 people that work there today, that each have families to look after? Are we going to say tomorrow morning, stay at home? Or are we going to try to ease our way into some kind of future? And that's our aim. And our aim there is, as we've said many times before, to bring in a strategic equity partner. But as SAA currently stands, ask the business person next to me, we'll have to pay him to take SAA over as government. That's where we stand. That's the reality. So we've got to position SAA so it's attractive enough as a bride or a bridegroom. And somebody would want to get married to SAA on some basis or the other. And that's the plan that we would put forward to the country.
But is there a business case for South African Airways?
No, there is a business case for a different kind of South African Airways going into the future. I think none of us would want, for example, there are many varieties around the world, let me put it that way. Qantas is privately owned, but the flag is identifiably Australian. British Airways is privately owned, but it's called British Airways, and the flag is there. Lufthansa is German, but it's privately owned. Swiss Airline is not Swiss, it's owned by Lufthansa. but it's got a Swiss identity. So from that kind of variety where you retain flag rights, if you like, to having a partnership, to actually calling in people who have expertise globally to come in and fix some of the enterprises that we are talking about, including SAA. SAA Technical used to be amongst the best on the continent and in the world. During this period of state capture, it's declined into nothingness. All right, so what do we do? Sit and moan about it, or actually put together a plan to float it a little bit and see, as I said earlier on, whether we can find partners to actually work with to reposition it in some kind of way. So when something fails, you can't just dump it because it has huge financial consequences and people consequences. So we need to go beyond the political rhetoric around the SOEs and say, what's the reality of changing them? What's the reality of repositioning them? What's the reality of moving them in a different direction? And I can assure you that this administration is very committed to doing that.
The CEO of SAA left a couple of weeks ago, and among the reasons we are told that he left was because he didn't get the cooperation from government. Government didn't deliver on the promises it made to him.
Look, I don't want to go into a small individual matter, because it is a small individual matter at the end of the day. But place yourself in a position where this is the minister, or you are the Minister of Finance, and this gentleman who works in one of the SOEs says, can I have a blank check, please? There's no blank checks available. So each of the entities in government, whether they are in SOEs or government departments, have to make a bid to the Treasury. And usually, as you know from my past, I would know something about this. If your budget is coming out at about R1 trillion, you'll have bids of 400 billion rands more. So not everybody is going to get everything. And working within the constrained environment that all of us have described means that you must have resilience, means that you must have patience, means that you must also understand the context in which you actually operate. So that you can be part of a team that can say at the end of a journey, I was part of repositioning a particular entity. So you have choices to make in life. No CEO, ask him, can decide who must be on the board to which the CEO accounts. That's impossible. It doesn't happen in the private sector. It can't happen in the public sector. But let me leave that there. I think the far more important question that we need to debate publicly and get more detail into is what is life going to be for each of these entities 10 years from now. And they can't remain as they are. So how do we put the minds of leaders and members of various constituencies together so that we can actually reposition them? And each of these entities, as the President pointed out, also need an entrepreneurial edge provided to them so that they become creators of jobs, of artisans, of all kinds of professionals who are given opportunities that they can use both within the state sector and in the private sector as well. But all of that doesn't just happen. You've got to create the right boards, the right leadership, and provide the right kind of context, but also understand the fiscal environment that we actually work in, which today is highly constrained and might be highly constrained for the foreseeable future unless we grow the economy together, unless we generate confidence in this economy together. And it's not, as my colleague pointed out, government that creates jobs. It does create its own jobs. 70% of our economy is in the private sector. So what's the relationship between the public and private sector? And how do we take it to a higher level than just the conversations in NEDLAC, so that we develop the common purpose and the urgency that the current situation requires to reposition this economy and therefore this country.
Vuyo, can I just say that on this council that the President talks about on state-owned entities, he mentioned it in February, he's mentioning it again. It's so urgent to move with that, because I do need to make the point that our push for restructuring of state-owned entities as business is not just about privatization. Yeah. We actually do believe that there are opportunities for strategic partnerships, and we've traveled that road before. We did a public offering on telecom, Over 60% of telecom today is in private hands. It's not owned by a private entity, but there are shareholders, a broad list of shareholders.
As we speak, Mr. Chana, sorry to interrupt you. You're talking about the fact that you are wanting to get into these state-owned entities, but your own track record doesn't really speak well, of getting involved in some of them. If you look, for example, at the way in which some of these government entities are often fronts for politically connected individuals, in the way in which boards are chosen. If you look at the way in which, let's say, what is happening at the PIC is coming out, then you need a lot more transparency on why people are on the boards. I mean, Malusi Gigaba still needs to answer to us why 2 Indian nationals were sourced out of the billions of people around the world, one to come work at SAA and the other one at Transnet. So the business interests of business people on these boards and their connectedness to politicians is something that we need transparency on. We definitely need that, because we don't know who in the ANC NEC is on what board.
I think that you are making a different point, which I agree with as it happens. But the point I'm making here is about restructuring of state-owned entities. We need capital. We need to capitalize those entities, and the state can't put in the money. So you do need private sector injection of capital in some of these. How do we do that in a way that is sustainable? We need to protect some of them from competition from other outside players. How do we do that? You do need other energy players, for instance, to generate electricity. But Eskom is a very critical player in that space. So the argument there is not about privatization of Eskom, it is about enabling energy security in the realm of electricity. What are the permutations of doing this across the key and critical sectors? So we need to have entered this conversation in an open-minded fashion to inject capital, to inject technology, to inject new skills, enable access to new skills, etc., etc. And the example I'm making about telecom is that we've done this successfully in the context of telecom, and we did it unsuccessfully in the context of SAA, where we brought in Swiss Air to take 20% of SAA. What are the lessons from all of this? So it's urgent that this council that the president is talking about is appointed quickly and it gets on with its work, because it's absolutely critical.
You're itching to...
Yeah, I'm a bit worried about trying to put in, the private sector as if the private sector is good. Telkom is really doing badly. If you ask any South African, Telkom doesn't answer calls. I mean, I've been trying to cancel my own Telkom line for 6 months, and it's not happening. So I wouldn't really put Telkom as a good example of private sector coming in and doing good, because they're not. And then also, I just going back again to the speech, one of the things that stood out for me is that the president said that he plans to, some of the money that is needed in terms of investment, he plans to bring in some pension funds. And that really concerned me, because as our representative from COSATU has already said, we know that trade unions have had a lot of corruption, particularly when it comes to pension funds. We know that there's a lot of corruption that has happened at PIC. So I'm really interested to find out how are these pension funds going to be invested in the economy, and what are the kind of structures that are going to be put in place to make sure that the wholesale corruption that happened at PIC and that continues to happen at various entities across government and even in the private sector, particularly when it comes to people's pension funds, how are they going to make sure that that corruption doesn't happen anymore? And I think also, business is sitting here and telling us, they're ready and they're interested and they want to be part of it. Why did our own government have to go out on an international tour to get money when South African businesses are sitting on billions of rands in their balance sheet? They are investing all across the continent. They are going into Asia. They are going into every single continent except for where they sit, except for where they actually make their profits. So we need to talk about what does it mean to be a South African business and what contribution are you making in South Africa?
Did I see you scratching your head there, Dr.
Over and above, just reaping profits from us and telling us you're going to partner with us.
I'm scratching my head because I chair a board of a company called Anglo Gold Ashanti. And that company is a South African company. And by the way, 75% of its share register is non-South African. So this idea of a South African and an international business is so myopic. The economy doesn't work like that. We are a globalized entity. We need to create opportunities to access capital wherever we can access it.
But economics is not exact science.
No, I'm
it's
not,
about sentiment.
That's irrelevant. The reality of the matter is this, that if you do not create opportunities to access international capital and you're operating in an environment with limited capital, you are not going to succeed. So South African businesses are working out there to make sure that they have access to international capital. And that's why we're encouraging government to go on international roadshows to enable that access to capital for state-owned entities, for private sector. All of us need access to that international capital because we don't have it in South Africa.
Okay, let's bring in Mr. Thema.
And then we'll come back to the pension fund.
No, thanks a lot, Vuyo. I think maybe at the outset, let's give credit to where it's due. I think the President last night struck the right chords on the emphasis around corruption and ensuring that you build up the state's capability to actually deal with these matters and the prosecution and so on. But I think it would be important to highlight the fact that not all corruption is going to go through the court system. And there are shortcomings within the public service, in the main and in business, for internal checks and balances to effect consequence management, and the continued recycling of individuals who will steal from Department A and then they will resign and move to Department B. And so we really need the Department of Public Service Administration to tighten the loopholes around that, because a lot of money is actually lost to what I would call soft corruption because it goes below the radar. And our focus goes on to your billions and so on, whereas you are actually losing and bleeding money on the daily on some of the soft corruption. So I think the emphasis on corruption was very, very important and was well received. And I think that the private sector would be well served as well to effect a similar kind of approach to actually deal with this corruption. But let's talk the numbers. You've got a good 11 million South Africans who are unemployed. The president's targets last night on quick math tell you that he's speaking only about 2.7 million jobs over the next 10 years. And so that immediately tells you that we are seriously in trouble. And so that's why one last night came out without anything tangible of hope that young people in the majority who do not have jobs will be able to find jobs. And I think and then the final point is to say, you are speaking about and encouraging people to create jobs and to be entrepreneurs, and that's very important. But the flip side of the coin to that is that those jobs need workers. Those jobs and you need to develop, therefore, a workforce which has got the necessary skills, knowledge, and expertise. And the issue is the investment we are making into our TVET colleges in comparison to your universities, University of Technology, is there's a huge inequality in that. TVET colleges have become institutions of circumstance and not institutions of choice. And that's why there's a big drive in any parent, in any society to say, go to university, because they look to a TVET and it doesn't inspire confidence. And so if we want to make these bold statements about technical skills, we need to be able to match them with an investment drive and a change drive to create a conducive environment around that. And I think we're speaking about interventions of government, war on leaks, and that happened. But have we spoken about the corruption that took place there, the extent to which money was pillaged? So all these initiatives, certainly, whilst they are good, they are subject to corruption because consequence management is lacking. So I think, as has been pointed out, it would be important in the budget votes for ministers to go into detail. And I think the President missed an opportunity yesterday by not focusing first firmly and keenly on his 7 priorities and the 5 sub-themes, it sort of got lost in the end and became airy-fairy, and it created a utopic reality, whereas the fundamental lived realities of our people, from increase in VAT, an increase in petrol prices on the monthly and so on and so forth, life is difficult. And that is where we would have expected the President out, whilst acknowledging it does not have to go into detail, but those issues which hit our people on the daily needed specifics.
Consequence management, Minister, add to that the pushback you were talking about earlier, within state-owned enterprises
I think the President indicated that all political parties over the last few months have gone to the ground, have listened to the people, and expressed a high level of empathy for the difficulties that people actually face, firstly. Secondly, whichever party is in government will be faced with the same issues on petrol price increases, because that's dependent on the oil price internationally and the exchange rate that you have in your domestic and global environment. Thirdly, I absolutely agree on consequence management. I've said it actually earlier on, and the President has said it as well. But we need to get our state enforcement machinery to start working. We need to get them to focus on the right people who've stolen or been part of the stealing process, so that they actually face the consequences. And we need managers within the state, and indeed in the private sector as well, who are not going to come short when it comes to taking a zero-tolerance approach to corruption. On the question of pension funds throughout the world invest in long-term projects, like infrastructure projects of 20 and 30 years. And the creation of an infrastructure fund, in which the President said government will put in 100 billion rands, the private sector in South Africa will come to the party, and particularly the pension funds, because they take a long-term view, not a short-term portfolio view of their returns. And we need that long-term money to come in. One of the reasons that we had the 2089 crisis is short-term money flushed even further with quantitative easing, an interesting topic for South Africans. That actually meant that emerging markets faced the consequence of money coming in and moving out at fairly rapid paces and destabilizing currencies and economies as well. So I think don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is this infrastructure fund. We need infrastructure investment. Pension funds, in the interest of their members, need to invest in infrastructure in South Africa so that they will also get the returns that are necessary. Yes, we need to make sure that the funds are run properly, that we don't have the kind of malfeasance that we are actually talking about. And ultimately, once we have 3 or 4 more people ending up in orange uniforms in this country, we will see that the curve turning. We will actually see that the public has a lot more confidence that whether a private or public sector, we are intent upon getting our society rid of corruption to the extent that we can, but much more importantly, begin to go back to the ethics of the Mandelas and Sisulus and Tambos, who would not take a cent of public money for themselves.
Let's bring in a couple of people in the few minutes we have left.
Thank you, Vuyo, and good morning to the viewers. As SAFTU, we foresee this. Remember, we issued a statement before the State of the Nation address to say, as SAFTU, we are predicting no change in terms of the status quo. Because as SAFTU, we have seen that the ANC is no longer the ANC of the left force. The ANC is no longer a revolutionary party that used to be, that we thought it would be. The ANC has allowed business to infiltrate and dictate to them what needs to happen and adopt their programs, IMF and the World Bank programs. And yesterday, the President came with a dream. He shared the dream with all of us. I want to agree with Sipho when Sipho says we really need to adhere to the ethics of leadership. When we saw those faces at the leadership of SAFTU, of those faces that are going to share the portfolio committees in Parliament. Immediately we said there will be no peace in Parliament. If the same people who were said to be involved in corruption are brought back to chair the the portfolio committees in Parliament. Again, the president shared yesterday his dream. And our people do not want these dreams. They've long been dreaming. The dreams are not going to be eaten by the people. Minister Pravin, our people, I want to disagree with you when you are saying it's not the prerogative of the president to unpack what is going to happen. The budget will fit to that. Our people want to know from the president, how are you going to return the land to its rightful owners? Our people want to hear the president, what is the program for wealth redistribution? That is why it's called the state of the nation. Our people want to hear that. And I was referring to Cuba at one stage to say that is why Fidel Castro was so successful in his socialism, because they were speaking Spanish. All of them, they were speaking Spanish. Our people, you must understand, others are speaking, there are 11 different languages in South Africa. But they need to hear the president saying to them, how are we going to distribute, not land reform, because the ANC now is coming up with the land reforms. We don't want that. We still feel that as SAFTU, we have deviated from the Freedom Charter, because the people have already been dreaming. Remember the 1955, the Freedom Charter. The world, this document, it was documented, and there was another document that the wealth shall be distributed equally. But that has not happened. The president is coming again with another dream. We feel as SAFTU that his speech has not addressed the implementation plan of all these programs. How is wealth going to be redistributed? Thank you.
Very quickly, Ms. Sona, you said earlier we should dream, but are you being dictated to by people like Dr. Pichana?
Nobody dictates to us, at least to some of us. But I think the issue isn't about dictation, it's about listening. And we must remain a listening organization. We must listen to feedback. Where people are unhappy with something, we must make the positive changes that are necessary in response to the feedback, firstly. Secondly, if we didn't have generations of South Africans way before 1912 and after 1912, dreaming of a democratic South Africa, embracing that dream in the Freedom Charter, and then fighting for that dream, not just dreaming. Some were dreaming, others were fighting for a dream. Right? And lots of people have scars from the fighting for that dream. We wouldn't have the South Africa we actually have today. Now it's the next 25 years. How do we dream of a different and better future? And what the president was outlining is a program that can begin to take us in that direction. And of course, you know, the president's political party got 57% of the vote. Other parties formed by your federation didn't even appear on the screen. So we have a popular mandate that actually indicates that what the ANC is saying in terms of its manifesto has some support in our country. And we've got to take that forward now. And where your demand is absolutely right, we will, it's not the budget vote, it's the individual departments that will have to say, and ministers will have to say, how are we going to implement the things that we've actually undertaken, including the issues of land, including the issues of reducing inequality and poverty, which the president mentioned a number of times in his speech yesterday.
I'm going to have you, give you, you have the last word. We only have 20 seconds left.
Just very quickly, I just wanted to come back to a very important issue from the president's address last night that Sipho highlighted, that spectrum. I mean, there are three big reasons why I welcome what the president said about getting on with this. Firstly, it can unlock a big new wave of investment in voice and data services, including in the rural areas. Secondly, it can produce an enormous amount of revenue for the National Treasury, which is much needed for the reasons the panel's been outlining. And thirdly, if you want to bring down the cost of data for ordinary South Africans, the only way you're going to do that and increase competition in the sector is to increase the amount of spectrum available to operators. So I really hope that that process moves forward quickly. Thank you.
And that is where we are going to leave it. Special thanks to our panelists, but also to the audience that woke up very early to be part of this conversation. The conversation, of course, continues. We have a lot to do as a country, but that's where we're going to leave it this morning. Thanks for watching.